So why don't we know much about what it is to be happy? Why do we suffer? There's so many aspects to that, isn't there, Philo? Um, and we can just develop it a little more fully and see where it goes.
Mm. Like, is suffering baked into the cake of being a human? That's the view, that's the Buddhist view, that no matter what happens here, there's going to be suffering. There's going to be old age, sickness, death, misfortune, and all of those things are baked in. And so baked into that also must be this tendency to want to avoid that.
Desire, perhaps. Uh, Desires could be said to be a classic way of avoiding, because by making it, having a desire, we determine what we do not want. We may not know exactly what we do want, but we draw some pretty powerful lines about our particular desires and interests in our well-being, in our being respected, in our being successful. Um, we're very conditioned by our culture, by our society to expect what things would make us happy and what things would challenge our security.
Yes, it seems like that without suffering is baked into the cake, and then in response to that, humans develop desires and fears around that suffering. So the desire to not suffer
Mm-hmm.
and the fear of suffering, and that's conditioned. That's conditioned from the get-go. Like even the child, as soon as that child is born, it knows that he has to go get some milk in order to not suffer.
Yeah.
And it instinctively goes for the breast. And that's actually a sign of healthy development in the child. So there's that. And then there's from the non-material idea, the non-material aspects of a human, happiness is our being. And somehow those two natures have to reconcile and come to some kind of a balance. Happiness is our being, yet the human suffers. And how do we deal with that apparent contradiction?
And who's the baker of the cake? What
Uh,
is the baker of the cake?
yes.
Could we say the mind, or maybe more precisely belief? In both cases, the mind being binary and it working in an either or way,
I
create
think it's prior to
fiction
mind.
prior to mind.
Yes. is prior to belief. Like the idea of the child immediately seeking the end of the suffering of being hungry, or in that first moments of birth.
Mhm.
I don't know if there's any mind in that other than the instinctive survival mechanism.
Yes. Yes, there's the physical, the need for food, clothing, and shelter. That's real in the human embodied experience. Yeah. And I think where the suffering may be coming from is in the psychological part of our being. That is our the notion of choice starts to come into the psychology of I, me, and mine occupies a certain necessary process, if you will, of the human experience. But also, as the me is sort of formed up in the psychology, and I become somebody in my mind, there is the baking of the cake that you were suggesting.
Uh, yeah, is that baking or is that the icing? Because I think that what happens is that there is suffering. Suffering is a part of the human reality, and then what can happen is there can be identification with that suffering, and that involves a me that suffers. But that identification, it seems to me, is more like icing. It's more like an additional layer on top of something that's core to being a human. And so it's our ability to identify with what happens to us, to make it personal and
Mhm.
to put a me there, a vulnerable me that creates what I would call a psychological suffering. So I think
Mhm.
physical suffering is what we should expect as human beings. Psychological suffering, perhaps, is something that we can learn to mitigate.
Yes, to live with is generally what 99.9% of human experience is. There's a coping and a hoping that are mechanisms that ease us through life in some way, some more, some less. Um, so one of the reasons perhaps we suffer is that we actually have an identity in our conflicts, in our anger, in our hate, or hate is a funny word because it seems to me to be related to extreme responses more than likes and preferences and denials, which are a milder sifting and sorting of experience. Um, we have a lot of mild sifting and sorting going on in the mind all the time. The hate part isn't so obvious because one has the prejudices that one believes in the mind are so powerful that hate isn't really seen in terms of extreme despising of a person, say, or of a whole nation or tribe or whatever. We actually feel we are better, superior, different, more than, etc. The supposed other.
Yes. And the hate seems like could maybe it's based on fear. There's this underlying fear which which generates hatred. The fear of the unknown. I can imagine. I can create a scenario or see a scenario where imagine you're a tribe and you are in a particular spot that you know well, and you're used to things being a certain way. You know where the food is, you know where the shelter is, you know where the water is. And then one day, this strange group of people show up, another tribe, and you've never seen that before. And so all of your worldview is now challenged. And it's bound to generate hate. It's bound to generate fear, which would then could turn into hate. I need to take care of this. I need to get these people out of here. That kind of idea. And actually, you saw this in the movie, the 2001, the Stanley Kubrick movie with the apes. And you saw the initial conditioning come into play. It was quite interesting. And it was somewhat along those lines, competition for resources, survival, challenging of worldviews, beliefs around worldviews, all of those ingredients.
So the Buddha said, oh, whatever, 2,500 years ago, and I don't quote particularly much, but that the cause of suffering is ignorance. And by that, he meant, it seems, my understanding would be that we are ignoring, there's an ignoring of reality, the ignorance of reality. The reality is that we're all human and all one consciousness. We're not a me separate and a you separate from a me. That's a ignoring of fact, an ignoring of reality that is systemic and alienating. And, you know, when you were talking about our tribal nature being threatened, gosh, if you can recognize and work with one's fellow humans, even though they're initially strangers, but if one recognizes that that supposed person is the same as me, has the same fears, has the same concerns, if you can work together on the threats to food, clothing, shelter, and all the other aspects that make life more beautiful and attractive, nobody would be hungry. There wouldn't be the fear. There would be fear in an instinctive sense from time to time, but we're talking about psychological insecurities that are founded on fear and desire. fears, desires, alternating. If we know ourselves, if we actually come into some direct connection with our being, we would know that we are peace, quite literally, not just sort of, oh yes, in a Hallmark card kind of way, peace, it's another misunderstanding. So man really suffers from ignoring understanding of his own or her own nature, which is peaceful, which is joyful, which is loving.
And somewhere along the line, something like that happened where tribes did collaborate and become bigger tribes and so on. And, and that's what we're kind of seeing today, even the US and its allies, the gathering of those tribes, right? So it hasn't changed psychologically.
Yeah.
There's been zero change psychologically, in fact.
We don't get the security that we're looking for from belief, because behind belief is doubt and fear. So even though we collectively believe something, we're quietly, subconsciously, perhaps, probably, um, trying to nail everything down. That's what the ego does. It maneuvers for its advantage. So if you've got a group of egos bumping into another group of egos, which is a way to put, there's nationalized ego on a large scale, there's tribal ego on a smaller scale, and then there's kind of family and community egos. All of that is based on a need to feel safe. And the only safety that's available, ultimately, the real safety, is in self-knowing. When there's that recognition, and it has to be a direct, graceful kind of recognition. I say graceful, that is, we can't do anything to be happy, to become happy, to achieve happiness. We have to go through all of that, it seems. I sure did. But one can arrive, so to speak, at a point where, Philo, you've used the term shedding, that aware living is a shedding of a constant shedding. Um, our being is naturally not fighting. It's not needing to fight. It's happy to love, to share, to give of itself, to not have to worry and calculate and manipulate. But very few of us are willing and able to actually take that deeper and deeper, to give up, let go of our favorite conflicts, our obsessions that seem to be who we are. Executives, professionals. That was my sort of MO in terms of respect and what I felt I was needed to be seen as, and really worked hard to establish. You'll have to let all of that go. And very few are willing to, first of all, actually directly see it for themselves. And then with that seeing, there's an immediate letting go. It's like see, let go, see, let go. A shedding is continual. As soon as there's resistance to what's actually going on in my direct experiencing of this moment, the resistance is shed. That's what happiness is, the shedding of all resistance to what is.
Yes, because in that shedding, being is revealed.
Yes.
Yeah, I think with the beliefs, I mean, there's a worldview out there that's materialist, and is one of the causes or one of the reasons why we have this sense of separation between tribes and people and so on. And that worldview is that there's a world out there that I need to navigate, and it's separate from me. That's our dominant worldview. So you can see how dualism, conflict, suffering fits into that picture. It's inherent in that picture. The dual viewpoint is inherently conflictual and gives rise to suffering. So that view has to, by some act of grace, has to be seen and seen to be possibly wrong. And maybe there's an alternative view that can be explored. And so there are different views of reality. There's the idealist view, which is the idea that everything is in the mind and there's no reality out there. This begins to get closer to what we might consider to be the non-dual view, where there's arisings happening in this awareness that seems to be there, not separate from the awareness and not in conflict with awareness. That's a view that would be more conducive to happiness.
Well, we seem to need our suffering. I mean, I can speak for myself, but there was certainly a lot of suffering as a result of what I feared and what I desired. I'll say big time for me on the scale of my individual life. Three advertising agencies, corporate world, all the stresses of ownership and cars and houses and whatever. Uh, it keeps one in a tension. A grid, talk about being gridded, where we can live off grid, but the only way to truly live off grid is to see in the moment what we're resisting what that there's a conflict going on between a supposed me who wants something to be other than what it actually is now, not was yesterday or could be in the future. Those are abstractions that come out of fear. The immediacy of being has to be met with being. It's not going to be met with ideas, with beliefs, with a new set of beliefs or better challenges, better ways to do things. That's how we get all caught up in self-improvement. That's the hoping and coping that I met or referred to earlier. It keeps us going, and people are having various qualities of life, QOLs, based on a kind of willingness to modify their responses, reactions appropriately, shall we say. In other words, we meet life and what it's presenting with a prejudiced opinion that life should be, could be, would be better if it only aligned with what we think it should be, would be, could be. And it's never going to align that way. And to the degree that it doesn't align, and to the degree that we resist that, we suffer. We need to suffer in that sense that if we don't recognize our suffering, we will not be motivated to really change.
Yeah, so and the fact that suffering even exists, conflict exists, suggests, if not a reason or a purpose, then perhaps a necessity. Perhaps it's just how things have to be in order for things to be. It's like who set all this up kind of a question. But so for me, what's prudent in all of this is to not identify with what suffering arises into my life. And that includes personal suffering, family members and friends, but also these large abstract kinds of impersonal suffering. And I'm talking here about wars and death and destruction on large scales. That one, it's not that one doesn't care. Of course, one cares. I often find myself crying on the sofa
Mm, mm,
when I see some of this stuff.
yeah,
But but that crying is a natural response that is just under surveillance too. It's being watched, and so it becomes it's just our humanity
yeah,
in that moment expressing in this way. So it's to me very important to not lose that. At the same time, to not identify and add to the conflict in that way.
yes.
To set up good guys and bad guys in this mental process here would be a mistake. But grace can give one that view just through the seeing of it, like you say. We become more human.
Fully, fully human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The less we identify, the more human we become.
And we can bring something into our relationships at all the levels that is really helpful. And I don't mean there's so many sort of attempts that we make. The idea of fighting for peace is one of the ones that I it's an oxymoron, but we enter into conflict because we demand that reality shape itself to our expectations. There is only one way to know the peace of one's being, and that freedom, and that is to know the essence of oneself. In other words, to not be limited to the body mind, like you're saying, Philo, and its productions, to see them, to not ignore them, but to be unattached, not detached. That suggests something that's avoiding and unattached is just the pure recognition of what is as it is now, not again, always now, always here. If it's not alive and in this moment, it's not alive. It's imagination, and it's a ideal that you referred to earlier. And one of my novels I wrote was called The Last Ideal. And it represented for me many years of what I thought was truth that I was seeking, the happiness that I was seeking. I thought it was to be found in the ideal.
More and more lately, I've, and I think it's partly to do with the shedding aspect, but everything, it just is more and more evident that everything that we're looking for is right here and not wherever it is we are looking for it. It's just right here.
Fully.
Yeah. And so the suffering that we're trying to avoid by running, we're just running into more suffering. Whereas the suffering that's here now, as part of this now, isn't really, it's just part of what is and has no duration. The duration is in the mental apparatus, the thinking, the thought stream,
Mm-hmm.
but actually suffering has no duration. Nothing has any duration.
Yes, you can see that in nature too. If you just sit quietly and watch nature, there's no suffering there. There is from time to time a conflicted nature, and we are nature. Let's not separate it like we're watching. Somebody different from nature is observing nature. It's not that way. It's nature. The nature of ourself is the same as the nature in a squirrel, in a cow, in a dog, in a human, in a country, however scale you want to change it to. Our nature is bountiful, full. There's no need, there's no lack. And when for example, I would watch some squirrels every day climbing this tree where I lived. And on occasion, there would be I'll just say an argument between one or two and whatever, and they actually seem to get angry in that. I don't go into, the causes of these things or whatever, but just to recognize that it passed, and within minutes or seconds, the two of them were playing together again. That's the nature of reality is that it happens. There's an experiencing, and the ing part, the verb passing part, passes. So as we sit right here now, is there any, conflict? Is there a war going on? I mean, it doesn't mean that we don't know about friction going on in the world, but bringing it directly to this moment, to this immediate experiencing, there's peace.
If something dramatic was going to happen in this instant, it would only be in this instant.
Mhm.
And the prolonging of the anxiety and the fear around possibilities is another source of unnecessary psychological suffering. I say unnecessary, maybe it is necessary for some reason. Somehow we have to learn through these experiences. We have to have these experiences in order to be able to learn from them and become wiser. But sometimes it sure seems like it's taken a long time.
Yes, it seems like it. Yes. Yeah.